Hello everyone, I'm going to be continuing from where I left off in the last video, but before I do that, I kind of want to summarize what it was that we talked about. So we were discussing the first cells, and starting at the very beginning, the first cells were most likely heterotropic prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are very simple cells, and heterotropic meaning they had to obtain their food by eating other things, in this case organic molecules. When that food supply started to run out, there was a pressure to evolve, and we eventually get autotropes, which are prokaryotic cells that can make their own food. Now, the process by which the first cells made their own food was chemiosynthesis, and they used chemicals in order to do that. Later, and also these cells were most likely archaea bacteria, which live in really harsh environments. Eventually, though, we do get cells that can do photosynthesis, and they create oxygen gas, which will form Earth's atmosphere. This also gives the opportunity for us to have aerobic prokaryotes, so prokaryotes that can use oxygen. Now we're to the point where we're going to talk about how do we go from these very simple prokaryotic cells to more complex eukaryotic cells. So I'm going to play part of this Amoeba Sisters video. The first minute of the video, they just discuss what a theory is. In science, a theory, it's not something like that you talk about in everyday language where you're like, oh, that's just a theory, and it sounds like there's not a lot of supporting evidence to back that up. In science, a theory is something that has a lot of supporting evidence. In this case, we're going to talk about endosymbiotic theory.
There were prokaryotes, much like there are today. They've been around for a long time. Well, just as there are in many organisms, there was variety in prokaryotes. Some of the prokaryotes had photosynthetic abilities, which means they could make their own food using sunlight energy. And those were the photosynthetic bacteria. Some of these prokaryotes were bacteria that had the ability to use oxygen to produce ATP energy. And some prokaryotes were larger, they could consume others, engulfing them. So obviously they had to be larger. The endosymbiotic theory is that some of these large prokaryote cells engulfed some of these small bacteria. But instead of those small bacteria getting digested, some of them remained intact within the large prokaryote, and they actually began to live as symbionts. That means they lived together. And for some of these cases, the larger prokaryote had engulfed the small bacteria that used oxygen to produce energy. This is believed to be the ancestor heterotroph eukaryote cell. And eventually, some of these cells engulfed the small bacteria that could do photosynthesis in addition, and there were some more living as symbionts. This is believed to be the ancestor autotroph eukaryote. Now, it's time to do a little reveal. We consider the bacteria that used oxygen to produce their own energy to have evolved into what is now mitochondria. And the bacteria that use sunlight energy to produce their own food, well, we consider those to have evolved into what are now chloroplasts. It's likely that these ancient eukaryotes had some kind of advantage in their endosymbiosis, and it's also likely that the mitochondria developed first, before the chloroplast, because if you remember from our Intro to Cells video, nearly all eukaryote cells have mitochondria. It's just that eukaryote cells that can do photosynthesis can have both mitochondria and chloroplast. Now, if you remember our beginning about theories, you may be wondering, where are the facts for this? We'll give you a few of the facts. First, mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. Yes, separate DNA from what is found in the nucleus. Not to mention that their DNA is arranged in a similar way to prokaryote DNA, specifically bacterial DNA. The size of mitochondria and chloroplasts tend to be similar to the size of bacteria, and when mitochondria and chloroplasts divide, which they can divide all on their own independently, they divide in a way that is similar to how bacteria divide. So the endosymbiotic theory provides an explanation for how modern eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes.
Alright, so I'm going to stop there. If you do want to watch the rest of this video, there's not much before and after the parts in which I played. That is also under helpful videos in your OneNote. It is the third video. So I do want to summarize the important points from that video in relation to endosymbiotic theory. So endosymbiosis if you actually break that word down, when we're talking about symbiosis, we're talking about a relationship, and that first part of the word endo means within. So mutually beneficial relationship, so in which both organisms are benefiting in some way. This occurred around 2 billion years ago. Again, the Earth formed around 4.5 billion years. So about 2.5 billion years later, we have the first eukaryotic cells. Now, and again, as they said in the video, larger prokaryotic cells engulfed smaller prokaryotic cells, which were, again, most likely that bacteria. And again, engulfed, so now the smaller bacteria, prokaryote, is living within the larger prokaryote, and it did not get digested. Once that small prokaryote was inside of the larger prokaryote, eventually we get the modern mitochondria. So the prokaryote that can use oxygen to make ATP, and it is aerobic. And we also get chloroplast. And these are those prokaryotes that can use the sunlight energy in order to make their own food and energy. And this is, again, how we get the first eukaryotic cells, or eukaryotes, which are more complicated cells that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. And as stated in the video, there's multiple supporting pieces of evidence. So the mitochondria and chloroplasts that are inside eukaryotic cells actually have their own circular DNA, and this DNA is different from the cell nucleus itself, and it's also characteristic of prokaryotes in that it is circular. Also, as stated in the video, they are similar in size to mitochondria, and chloroplasts are similar in size to prokaryotes, and they also divide in the same manner. And this is how we go from the first prokaryotic cells to the first prokaryotic cells that were very simple to the more complex eukaryotic cells.